So I want to begin by thanking Dr. Matthew Plummer and Dr. Ronald Sheehan for organizing this genius gathering. And I think that we will all benefit for years to come from our gatherings over last year and this year and perhaps multiple years in the future. So with that beginning, I want to just talk about my books from a personal perspective. So when I was about 10 years old, my family moved from the small town that I lived in into the countryside. And so all my buddies that I used to hang out with after school, sometimes we played hooky and so on and so forth, I missed them. So I'm out in the country, there's no kids around, and so I said, well, what am I going to do now? So my friends became books, and at that point I started becoming a voracious reader. And this reading sort of led me to the idea that, hey, I'm living in Florence, it's a segregated society, we have a public library, and they've got all these books in there, but I can't access them. So one day we were walking home from school, and a buddy of mine, Henry Thomas, we said, hey, why don't we go and try to integrate the library.
Henry Thomas.
So what happened, this was shortly after February 1st at A&T, where 4 students went and did a sit-in at the lunch counters. And Mays always talks about this as sort of the spark, you know, that led to all of the protests of the 60s. Now, so we went to the library and tried to get a card, and they said, no, you can't, get a card from this library. It was written in the charter of the library. So we decided to grab books out of the stacks and go sit down. The library was closing at 6. We said, we're not leaving until you guys give us some books and give us a card. And so they said, well, the library's closed. You got to get out of here. So they said, if you don't leave, we're going to call the police. So they indeed called the police, and within 2 or 3 minutes, the sirens, the lights sparkling out in front of the library, the police came in. I think it was 2 or 3 of them, and they stood over us and were sitting at the table, and they said, boys, the library's closed, you gotta go. And they said, no, we're not leaving until we get our card. And so they said, well, if you don't go, we're gonna take you off to jail. So we did a huddle, me and my boy, and we said, okay, we're gonna leave, like you say, guys, but we'll be back. And so indeed, we left and did not get arrested, and we came back the next day, and then we saw a sign on the door saying, library closed for renovation. So we kept going back and forth, and eventually we got to the point where 2 months later, this was around November, December, when we started, on George Washington's birthday, February 22nd, in 1961, we went back to the library and it was finally reopened again. All those months they had closed it. And we walked in and we asked for a card. Sure enough, the lady gave us a form, we filled it out, we got a card, we took books out for the first time. Now, so years later I found out that we shook up the whole system because they had tied segregation to Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal, the so-called concept. And they had to revamp the whole board structure of the library because of, I didn't realize that till later after I went and visited the library just about 3 years ago. And so we changed the structure, and they then allowed all black folks to use the main public library. So why am I telling this story? I'm telling this because this really inspired me about the importance of books, right? And so all through school, I was very keen on reading and learning as much as I could about any and everything, right? And I think when I was at school at Berkeley, as a graduate student studying epidemiology and trying to get a public health degree, I had an epiphany after seeing all of the scholarship and intellectual power at this university of writing, becoming a writer. You know, saying so in a sense that became my gig economy of trying to write and contribute to the literature in the world. And so each of the books that I ended up writing as I was doing other jobs, and basically based on an experience I had at Morehouse, which gave me a lot of opportunity to actually leave Morehouse and go to other institutions. First of all, I went to Bowdoin as an exchange student along with Ruben, and I also went to Oak Ridge National Laboratory and worked in cell biology, and subsequently I ended up going to Finland, working with a researcher in Finland at the University of Helsinki in cell biology. And also Crossroads, Africa, which was really a big deal for me in terms of saying, well, here's the world out here. You can live in the rest of the world. You know, you don't have to confine yourself to the U.S. borders. And so I ended up spending close to 30 years working overseas. I worked in Hong Kong, basically practicing dentistry and learning acupuncture and learning the martial arts. And then I worked in Suriname with the Ministry of Health, teaching dentistry and also working in the epidemiology unit. And I did a paper on dengue disease, which is one of the viral diseases that has spread even to this day all over the tropics. And then I subsequently spent most of my years in Saudi Arabia working as a professor at King Saud University, head of public health dentistry, and subsequently I worked for the National Oil Company as a head of preventive dentistry unit for the health system there, serving 300,000 people. And then the third project was I worked on setting up a research university that was based on the MIT model. And this university was financed by the King of Saudi Arabia, King Abdullah, and he put in $7 billion to build it, and then subsequently he put in $23 billion to establish the endowment, which made it the third in the world after Harvard and Yale in terms of endowment size. So that university now, after 12 years of existence, is now ranked 121st in the world in terms of research output that has huge impact in various fields of graduate. It's a graduate university. They have students from all over the world, a lot of students from China and India, South America, Brazil, and so on. And so they are really on a roll in terms of producing. So all these years while I was doing these different projects, I was writing on the side, you know, at night, early in the morning. I wake up 4 o'clock in the morning. And one of the things I learned in that process was the idea that you can take a long-term project and do just a little bit every day, and you'll be amazed how much things accumulate over time, you know. And so, like, for example, this is the first book that I actually published, and it was based on me working on. I was a school board member for 6 years at the American International School in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. And the last position I had, I held every position on the board, and the last position was chairman. And in that, I became, like the people in the Far East say, I developed what we call education fever, which is how you really pursue all of the things you can for your kids that will get them ahead educationally. So I started cataloging all of the things that I did for my kids to try to get them into higher institutions. And this is the book that resulted, and it's called Secrets from the Cradle to College Admission at MIT and the Ivy League. And what happened in this book was that we found out that, you know, there were huge amounts of things that you could do that would make yourself appealing to admissions committees at top schools. And I tried to get my kids in all these in terms of activities, sports. One of the things that I did for my 2 sons, I was teaching at the flagship university, and I went to the math department, and I found a guy who would tutor them every Saturday, which was in Saudi Arabia, it was Thursday. Thursday and Friday were weekends in Saudi Arabia. And every Thursday I would take my kids to his house, and from the 6th grade on, my sons were tutored on reverse engineering the SAT math questions. And this guy did it like a pro, and my kids went really way ahead in math. And that helped them get into top boarding schools. The schools only went to the 9th grade where I was a board member. And they had to go abroad to go to the 10th, 11th, 12th. So both of my kids, one went to one of the oldest boarding schools, Phillips Academy, Andover, Mass. And the second one went to Choate, the same school that JFK went to for boarding. And they got a huge education there. Yeah. And that school at Andover helped my oldest son get into MIT. And the transition from Andover to MIT was very smooth because he was able to benefit from all that math that he got early on. You know, like some people get a tennis instructor, I got a math instructor and then they were involved in sports like swimming, age group swimming, and soccer and a few other things, and that really propelled them into getting into the schools. My youngest son ended up going to Williams College after Choate. So that was the basis for this particular book that I wrote. So now the second book that I want to talk about is a book called Antarctic Collapse. And so after doing this, well, I had actually started on this book before I started on this one. In '75, when I was in Hong Kong, I was living in one room and I was doing what we call a gap year, where I was just going, I took a martial arts course in Boston, and while I was at Harvard doing a residency, and I got really interested in the Eastern culture. And I decided, so well, I'm gonna go over there and really check this place out. So I just dropped everything and went out, and I lived in Hong Kong for a year, studying martial arts, practicing dentistry on a volunteer basis, and just absorbing the culture. And so while I was there, I got a wind of this idea. This was in '75, and I got an idea that, you know, I started reading about the prospects of climate change and how it might affect humans. And so early on, you know, that's a really big deal now, right? But early on, that wasn't really talked about that much. So I started researching it. And so I wrote this book about what would happen if the oceans, you know, sea level rise would really occur. And so this is my first attempt, if you will, at writing a novel. And so it has some interesting twists and turns and so on. And it actually conforms to what's happening even actually right now. I was really surprised because I had a point in 2027 in this book where the oceans would rise to the point where it's really causing trouble on all the coastlines around the world. And by the way, there's a glacier in Western Antarctica called the Thwaites Glacier that there was a huge report that just came out recently where the melt rate is way faster than they thought. And so that's what they call the Doomsday Glacier. And if that glacier melts, all the coast, half of southern Florida is going to go. And in every coastline around the world is going to be changed. And that's going to be potentially an extinction event, which is, you know, a frightening thing to say, but humans may not be able to deal, especially with ocean rise and also with temperature change. Because right now in India and in Pakistan and all across the tropics, there's a point where the temperature will reach a level and the humidity will reach a level where people cannot work outdoors. And that's going to change dramatically the whole, you know, geopolitics. People are going to be migrating, you know, climate refugees and so on and so forth. So anyway, I deal with a bit of that way back when I started writing this in this book.
Is that a novel?
You may have,
Yeah, this is a novel, right?
you may have mentioned it, but I missed it. What was the impetus for
which one?
writing on this?
On this topic? Yeah, I started finding out way back in '75 about the potential for climate change well before people were talking about it, right? Like they are now. Okay?
What prompted you
what
to think?
prompted?
Yeah, I said I had this epiphany at Berkeley where I said I'm going to be a writer. So then I said, well, maybe I should try to write a story. And as a sentinel warning about what might happen, so people could say, hey, and that's what we really need. I mean, just think about it right now. There's, climate change is imminently potentially to really destroy human civilization. As it's nice to say that, but that's a really, right now, okay, the temperature that has changed since the pre-industrial level of society in the 1800s has been 1.1 degrees Celsius increase. Now, what the goal of the IPCC is for us not to go past 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. At 1.5, we still have catastrophic events that can occur. A return in terms of extreme weather events, sea level rise, etc. Now, right now we are on track not to go because the countries in the world are not cooperating and they are not committing to what they say they're going to do in terms of reducing carbon emissions. Gates, in his recent book, has pointed out that we got to have carbon emissions to zero in 2050. Right now, 50 some gigatons of carbon is put into the atmosphere annually, and we've got to reduce that to zero by 2050. Otherwise, civilization is at risk. Question?
It's a bigger problem that nobody talks about. They know it exists. Basically, there is a decrease, I don't disagree, is an increase of a rapid increase of the breakdown of Antarctic and Arctic substructures. Not structures, but, well, we know over millions of years, animals, trees, everything organic has died in those places, and they were covered with ice. The ice is melting away.
Right.
And what it's producing is a lot of methane.
Oh yeah.
Into gas.
Yeah, methane is a gas which has maybe 50 times the global warming impact as carbon dioxide.
Absolutely.
And clearly the peak the permafrost in the north temperate zone is melting all across Siberia, all across Canada and Alaska. And as that permafrost melts, we've got more and more methane getting in the atmosphere, and it's going to have a much more impact. Yeah, more impact on climate change than carbon dioxide. So that's certainly a huge sort of hidden problem. And there's some PBS series on what's happening in the top upper temperate zone where permafrost is melting. So that's a really good point.
But the Sanchez here is worrying about woke.
Yeah, right. So we are all concerned about these irrelevant issues in society when the whole civilization that we live in is at stake. Okay, so that's basically the book on climate change. Now, the third book that I want to talk about is a book called Secrets to a Richer Life, which is kind of a presumptuous title to make. But what I've done in this book is while I was in Saudi Arabia, we set up an age group swimming program for our kids, and it was a parent-run thing. And while the kids were swimming, I used to get into these conversations with people from all these different countries, and they would be telling me about what they were doing in their families, their culture, their kids, why they were really, focusing on getting their kids ahead. And so I got this idea. I said, wow, I'm getting all this cool information from people why don't I try to codify, do a study. For my epidemiological studies, I developed an hypothesis that since humans emerged out of Africa 300,000 years ago and migrated all over the world, Homo sapiens all belong to one family. And so I said, my thesis in this book, my hypothesis is that if we interview people with the same questions from different cultures, that we would come up with a conclusion that we are all in the same family, because we all have the same aspirations, hopes, and dreams for our families. We all have the same influences from our parents. And so I put together 37 questions that would sort of codify that. So if you read this book, you'll see interviews in here from people from all the continents and all the major cultures, and you'll see that there's a common thread where, if you ask someone from China and you ask someone from UK the same question, there'll be a very similar response in terms of what they would say about their parents, what they would say about their children, and so on. So that's what you'll find. And the other bonus in this book is that at the end, I went and found all these different lists of books that were major books in different categories, like the top 100 novels in America, the top books out of Africa. There's a list at the back of this book which covers these major books. So there's a list of several, I guess a couple thousand books in here that are major books in the various cultures of the world. So that's this particular book. We got a question from Matt.
Yeah, Ernie, to what degree did the answers you got in the questionnaire of the people from all parts of the world, to what degree did the similarities in their answer, to what degree was the similarities in their answer resulted in the fact that they were educated?
Okay, got it. I think education plays a big role in this because, because these were people primarily who had migrated to Saudi Arabia in terms of positions that required them to have a college degree or a master's degree, and that was the sample that I actually interviewed. So I think that if I had interviewed, say, some of the workers who were lesser educated, I might have gotten a different set of answers. But I think, take one question, for example, children. What would you do for your children? I think I would get a similar answer no matter what the socioeconomic status of a person is, because everybody wants their children to be ahead of what they accomplish.
Maybe that is and is not true. But if you ask an indigenous person of South America who was not exposed to Western thought and Western influence,
right.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. There's a group that, in addition to like the indigenous people in the tropical rainforests of Brazil, actually one of the countries I lived in, Suriname, I actually had some interactions with the Amerindians there, as well as the indigenous African Americans in the jungles of Suriname. And clearly, you're right. They would definitely have a whole different worldview, because their worldview is based on living in the tropical, in the rainforest. And by the way, I would compare their knowledge of survival in the rainforest to a PhD in physics.
Yeah,
because they've got a PhD. If you just dropped us off in the middle of the Amazon, how many of us would survive? It would be a lucky break if you could make it, because actually when I was there, I actually lived right in the rainforest, and actually a house that I was living in, my wife was pregnant with my first son. It was taken over by army ants. One day I woke up and ants were everywhere. They were coming out of the ceiling, and then I ran out of the house and I was trying to figure out what was happening, and I saw this column of ants this wide, coming up, and out of all these houses around, they came into my house, they came up, these houses were built on stilts, and they came up, and they got into the attic, and then they came in, and I spent 2 weeks trying to get rid of these ants, and I gave up. So the ants, the ants won, humans 0. And I left.
How did you convince your wife to go on this journey?
Right, okay, so
And
there you go.
Still paying for it.
The determination that I learned at Morehouse.
You need to write a book on that.
Yeah. Well, here's a quick. I'm gonna give you a quick story on that. You know, I had just come back from living a year in Hong Kong in one little room, and sort of venturing out every day and just taking in the culture. You know, I didn't have a job. I had a little bit of savings from practicing dentistry before leaving, and so when I got back, I left after a year, and I came back to Boston, and so I was moving into this apartment with 3 other Indian guys. It was like a shared apartment, and I was in a Volkswagen Bug driving down the street one Saturday, and I heard them announce at Elmer Lewis School, we're gonna have an all-women's conference, right? Okay, so the first thing that came to my mind is, will they let me in, you know? All right, so I go to this conference, and this is a school started by a black lady. She's very famous in Boston, Elmer Lewis. And so I'm walking in, and I see one other guy in there, and all these women, right? So it turns out that while I was there, I met this lady that was one of my kung fu partners before I had left Boston, and I hadn't seen her in a year. She was a Japanese-American Kimi. And so Kimi was sitting with 2 of her friends. And so I started talking with Kimi, and then I started noticing the lady next to her. and so eventually I handed this lady next to her, after having some conversation with the friend of Kimi, and I handed her my book, said, well, how do I get in touch? So luckily, she wrote down an accurate phone number on this notebook. And so I called her up, and we spent like 3 hours on the phone on the first conversation. So I started dating her, and she was born in Hong Kong, came to the US when she was 4 years old, and grew up in Far Rockaway, New York. And she has 5 brothers and sisters. And today, this whole family, they all got postgraduate degrees, and she had one brother that built a company that's based on Chinese manufacturing, where at the peak they had 200,000 people building quilts for them in China, and they had a turnover of $100 million annually. And that was one of her brothers, right? And that shows you how these immigrants come to the US and do incredibly well in terms of getting an education and so on. So now my wife, I was telling her that, hey, I want to go to South America. I had already been to Suriname, and I met with the Minister of Health, and how did I get to why did I go to Suriname? It's a northern tier South American country that has, it's the only country in South America where they speak Dutch, Netherlands. And I had read this article by a guy named Hilders A. Poindexter, who was a professor of tropical medicine at Howard University, and he wrote a book about public health problems in West Africa. And I was very interested in that because I had spent time in the Cameroons on Crossroads. 3 months we were there, and I said, wow, Africa is an incredible place. So I said, on a trip to DC, I was living in Philadelphia at the time, on a trip actually I was living in Boston at the time. I trip to DC. I walked into this guy's office. He was an emeritus professor at Howard at that point. He had lived all over the world doing tropical medicine, and he'd written a book. He wrote one book about Suriname called My World of Reality, which was it's really good book. And Hilders Poindexter was a Harvard MD, African American, and walking into his office unannounced, I ended up having a 3-hour conversation with him, and he sort of gave me a whole ideas about living overseas. And he told me, he said, look, I told him I was making a trip to the Caribbean, and I wanted to go to certain islands. He said, well, when you go, include Suriname in your trip, because I found it to be a very interesting place. And sure enough, I did. And eventually, I went to Suriname on that trip, and I met the Ministry of Health, actually the head of the whole health system, and he told me if I come back, I could have a job. So I always kept that in my mind. And so then going back to my significant other at the time that I had in Boston, we were living together, and over a 2-year period, after my wife got a degree in social work from Boston University, she was working in Boston, and I kept like daily almost telling her, I want to go to South America, let's go, let's go. She was saying, I don't know about that, you know, and blah, blah, blah. So eventually what I did was I got a ticket for both of us to go to Suriname. And I said, well, we got these tickets now, we got no choice, you know. So I ended up, that's how she went to Suriname with me after having a MSW degree and having a good job, and she dropped all that, and so we ended up having, our 2 sons were born in Suriname. She got a job, I met some people there, and well, of course, a lot of people, and she got a job in the dermatology department as a statistician, and I was working in 2 departments. I was working in the dental section as well as the epidemiology section. And actually, they sent me abroad to a place called CAREC, which is the Caribbean Epidemiology Center, for conferences, and then we wrote reports. So I was getting into a lot of stuff with them, and that was a great experience for 3 years. They had a military coup, and I said, well, it's time to get out of here. I got 2 little kids. I don't know what's going to happen. So that's when we moved to Oregon after leaving Suriname. And so that's how I ended up, convincing my wife to live overseas. So we had a great time going back to the U.S. and learning about the Northwest and Oregon. And we picked it out over 3 cities. We went to Seattle, Vancouver, British Columbia, and Portland. And we decided to go to Portland because that appealed to us the most. So then I want to go back to what happened over time. I decided that when I was on this project in Saudi Arabia to do this new university, I started meeting all these great scientists from different major universities around the world: Far East, Europe, Stanford, Berkeley, Penn State, Texas, University of Texas, MIT, etc. And we were recruiting them to work on this, to be faculty at this new university. And so I met these computer science people, and then I got another idea, and I started. And then I read a book in 2005 called The Singularity is Near. And that was a book by Ray Kurzweil, an MIT inventor, who was making all these predictions about what was going to happen in the future, particularly with AI. And that really caught my attention. I said, wow, this is going to really happen. And this guy has a record of being 80% accurate on his predictions, right? And so I started thinking about AI back in 2005, and then I said, well, what? And then I started realizing one of the points that he made was that AI has to be ethical, and it has to be something that's aligned with human values. It has to be something that benefits humanity. Now, the risk is that AI can develop double exponential, if you will, and not be aligned with what humans want. And it actually can, create an extinction event for humans. That's the risk of AI. Now, so I decided that I was going to read up on everything I could. So I read maybe 20 books and also like 500 articles about AI in terms of preparing to write this novel. And so that resulted in this book. I started writing this book in around 2007 while I was working on this project to build this new university. And so I sort of took my title off of what I read. The book was called The Singularity is Near. And I said, well, if you don't realize why was why were the Europeans able to colonize so many parts of the world? One of the key factors in that was a development of how to read longitude on long sea voyages. So Queen Anne in England offered a prize for someone who would develop a way for mariners to calculate. They could calculate latitude, but they couldn't calculate longitude. So that made sea voyages very risky and fraught with danger. So this prize was won by a carpenter who developed a device that they could put on a ship, and it could actually help them calculate what the longitude was. So it was called a longitude prize. And that's the first prize that was laid out to come up with a new technology. Subsequently in the U.S., there's a guy, Diamandis, who developed something called an X Prize. And the first prize that he developed was, they would reward, I forgot, something like maybe $10 million to the group that could have a civilian project that could go into outer space. And this guy was able to get top astronauts involved. Peter Diamandis, he's an incredible guy, MIT graduate, Harvard Med grad, huh?
What's the timeline on this? What years these?
What? Oh, this was, when you say timeline for what?
For this development of these longitudinal things that they're doing.
Oh, that's in the, I think in the 1600s, early 1700s, in that time frame. That was just before, the Portuguese conquered, and colonized Brazil, and they went all the way to the Far East, to Macau. The Portuguese were incredible. If you go to Portugal, you go to south of Portugal, a place called Sagres, you can see they had a school for navigation. Yeah. And the Portuguese were probably the best navigators out of Europe, in terms of, of course, Columbus, coming to the U.S. and America.
Magellan, Portuguese?
What is that?
Magellan from Portugal?
Magellan, good question.
I think so.
Well, he may have been Spanish.
I know that, I think Magellan was Spanish.
The Netherlands?
I think that Columbus was Italian, right?
Right,
and
the Catholic Church.
But then Vasco da Gama was Portuguese.
Oh,
And he was the one that sailed around Cape Good Hope of Africa, and I got all the way to India looking for spices, right? Okay, so going back to this book, so over this period of say 2010 to 2018, I was writing a little bit every day. I might go a year or two and not write anything, and then say, oh wait a minute, I'm working on this project. Go back to it. So finally, I came up with this book, and so what I've done is talked about ethics, and I sort of review when you think about Mays and the impacts of black folks on the U.S. I think we have been the moral compass of this country from day one, right? And certainly as AI, which purports and is predicted to be the most disruptive technology that we will have or we've ever had. Our moral force in this country is very important for this technology. And clearly, that's one of the dilemmas that we are in right now. This is progressing exponentially. There's a lot of competition among the top tech companies to be the first and so on, especially after ChatGPT came out in November, and you have them rushing to put a lot of this stuff in the public, and we don't really know what the impact is going to be. And there's a lot of dire predictions that it's going to be really bad if we don't really have regulatory aspects to that. So clearly, we need to be, as a public, aware of all of this stuff that's happening, and we need to be right on top of it in terms of insisting that it becomes something that has ethics embedded thoroughly in it. We need to have what we call parameters, training models that will look at everything that's ever been written in history about ethics. That's one of the big advantages of these large language models, is that they are able to absorb all the literature. Like, for example, in medicine, they can absorb all the medical literature, especially the ones that's coming out daily almost, and use that in their decision making about diagnosis and about therapy. And clearly that is something that needs to be regulated, because there's a lot of bad actors out there who can take this technology, and that's one of the problems from fire until atomic weapons. They can be used for good, or they can be used for bad, right? And that's really important in this particular area. So this book talks about the ethics and how this prize was set up to award the group that came up with an ethically based AI that was beneficial, that had an intelligence superior to humans, but not just humans, but to all humans combined. And so that's the kind of intelligence that is hard for us to even imagine. And also, you know, the whole theory that came up with this idea, this singularity is a concept borrowed from physics, where at the center of a black hole, there's what they call a singularity. And so it's a pivot point. And so this is the idea that was taken regarding AI, that this will be a pivot point in human history where we don't really know what's going to really happen after that, because this high intelligence will be superior to humans as we are to ants. And we will be hopefully at the mercy, or hopefully at the mercy of a benevolent AI. And because if it decides that humans are not necessary, and by the way, a lot of I was looking at some YouTubes just recently, a lot of top researchers are actually predicting that AI is, we really, whatever we do, we really are not going to be able to save ourselves. And they are really coming up with these dire ideas. So there's two things that are really at risk for humanity right now. There's climate change, and then in terms of creating extinction events, and also AI. And I think that's what the public really needs to be aware of, so that we can really make sure that this is regulated, and that the potential or possibilities of creating AI that's going to be beneficial, that will be helpful for us. So the last thing I want to say about this is that I wrote a screenplay for this, right? And so I've been shopping this screenplay all around to try to get somebody to finance it to do a movie, because I think it would be very helpful for society to really. Yeah, because I wanted Spike Lee to get a copy of this screenplay. So I knew Spike Lee lived in Martha's Vineyard, and because I have a nephew that have a house there, and so I sent this thing. I found out where his house was, and I got an address, and I sent the book and the stuff to him, but it never reached him. I mean, well, if anybody here knows how I can reach Spike Lee, that would be really helpful.
He's in Edgartown.
Huh?
He's in Edgartown.
Yeah, I know. He's got a nice spread over there in Martha's Vineyard.
Yeah.
So clearly, I think a movie about this story, it's not necessarily the best written novel, but it's a novel that has sentinel aspects in terms of warning and letting people know about the possibilities and the dangers of AI. So
Juanita read that book and she was excited about it, man.
Okay.
She did. She really. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, okay, that's good feedback.
Are you selling your autograph too, or just?
Well, I'm not really, all these books, I'm not really particularly interested in it from a financial. It would be helpful, but I'm interested in mainly to try to get a message out, or based on a lot. I've read a lot of books, right? And I must have several thousand books in my house. I've collected books over the years, and so what I call my house in Oregon, I call it a learning palace. So as at this point in my life, when I'm really not doing a regular job, I spend a lot of time reading. I'm reading all kinds of stuff. And I watch a lot of YouTubes. I watch an incredible amount of interesting lectures, conversations, dialogues on YouTube. I mean, YouTube University is the best thing going right now. I highly recommend it if you haven't started. And what happens, they have an algorithm on YouTube where after they see you watching a few things, they know exactly what you lack, right? And they'll present stuff. Every day I log into YouTube, I get new stuff that's coming out that's right down the alley of the stuff I'm interested in, right? Okay, so now what's this book?
That's your mama.
All right, so my incredible mom is somebody that that obviously, as all of us, we have high reverence for the person that brought us into the world. And so I thought about all the stuff that my mom has done in life, and I said, wow, this is an interesting story that other people could take a look at. And so on a trip, my sister, I had one sister who went to Fisk, and she and my mom were going to a conference in Myrtle Beach, and they met somebody who was interested in my mom. My mom was 99 at that point. And so they told my sister, they said, you got to get somebody to write a book about your mom. She's got a hell of a story. So on the way back in the car, they called me up, and they told me what this guy said. So this was around November, and she had a birthday that February coming up to be 100 years old, February 11th. And so between November and February 11th of 2018, I started writing this book. And I'd already accumulated a few things about my mom. I'd interviewed her with, most of you did an interview that I had a set of questions that we were talking about earlier. And I interviewed her with those questions, so I had that. I had written a blog about her and comparing her to Nelson Mandela because they were born in the same year. And so I was saying they both were freedom fighters, right? And because my mom was the wife of my father, who was the president of NAACP in Florence for 18 years during the height of the civil rights movement. Highly risky situation, right, in South Carolina, right? And so I was talking about how my mom was supporting my father at that point. They didn't have any fear. I was really amazed by that. They were sort of fearless. I said, well, what's my excuse? If they were that fearless back then, And so I decided, so I started putting all this stuff together, and I was calling up my mom almost daily to ask her questions about stuff. And so I put this book together, and I was able to have this thing published, and we presented 300 copies to the audience that came to her celebration of 100. We had the Florence Civic Center booked, and we invited people from all over the country who knew her, and we celebrated her 100th birthday, and I passed out this book to all of the people that were there. And so it gives an interesting story in so many respects. And one of the things I want to spotlight about my mother is that she spent, after my father passed in 1980, she lived alone from 1980 until 2021. And all those years, she was super productive artistically. She produced, there's pictures of her China painting that she developed this hobby. She was first a seamstress, that was her career, and she did really well in that, and she became a huge success doing sewing, and she taught sewing, and then she decided to switch over, and she traveled all over the country to take courses to learn how to do China painting, and as a result, she has this huge collection, which I have in storage now, and I hope to have it displayed as a display for her artwork. So we just celebrated her 105th birthday this past February, and we did a Zoom call, and we had 75 people on the Zoom call, and we celebrated her reaching 105. She left. She was living alone until she was 103. She was driving. Her license right now expires in 2028.
Wow.
And she left in 03, and she's now living with my sister in Orangeburg. I was just there for a couple of weeks in early January, and she's doing really well. She's not. One of the reasons why, I was speculating, why is it that she can reach this age, Well, there's a genetic component, which is about, according to the research, about 25% of longevity. But there's 75% that's related to lifestyle. And lifestyle involves diet, exercise primarily. And not only that, social connections. And she is a PhD in all three of those in terms of she has a huge, vast social network. We still have Zooms with her friends from Florence after she moved to Orangeburg. And she's still mentally sharp. She's physically less able to do the things that she used to do because she used to walk in the mall every morning, 5 o'clock. She'd get up and she did an hour with friends walking around the curve of the edges of a mall. And that was she pursued from age of late 50s up to she was 80 something. And that is still benefiting her, I think. And today, I was spending time just checking her out, figuring out, what was happening. She walks from her bedroom to the kitchen 3 times a day to get the meals that my sister prepared. And she has a lady coming in about 5 times a week to just take care of her for a couple of hours every day. And my sister, I salute her for doing an incredible job of helping her mom. And my sister is in her mid-80s at the moment, and she's taking care of her mother. And I feel really like I need to be doing a lot more, to help my sister out. But anyway, that's the story of this particular book. And I think that one of the things that I was saying to myself is that even if this doesn't become a bestseller, and it has not, it is something that can be passed down in my family that can be an inspiration for future generations. And I think one of the key things that my mother taught my sister and I was that education is the most critical thing that you can do to pursue life. And I think if that message gets out, I think it'll be a clear and message that will be beneficial going forward in the future. And clearly she has inspired us, and it became part of our subconscious, if you will, that we were going to college. It was not if you would go, it was like when and where you would go. And that was the kind of thing that motivated my sister. My sister became a math teacher in Orangeburg. She later became a vice principal of a school, and then later she became the head of adult education for Orangeburg County. And she's now retired, but involved in the Deltas and all the different organizations. She's been a CEO of the board of a credit union for like 30 years. And even at this point, when she's taking care of my mother, she's still super involved. So I give all that inspiration to my mom. So that's my story, guys, and I really appreciate that you guys have listened and tolerated.
Hi, Tim.
Have a seat.
Oh yeah.
So I'm open for questions.
You got one right there.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
At our gathering last year, you passed out those last 2
Yes.
bookstores? Okay. The other question is, do you do any lecturing?
Uh,
And are you open to the idea of going different places with a message, or maybe several messages that you think are critical?
Yeah, absolutely. I do not do travel around doing lectures.
Your TED Talk.
But what I would like to do is I actually have written a TED Talk on a project that I became interested in as a result of my experience developing a new university, and that was based on the idea that if they build a university in Saudi Arabia that's a research base, I can help to establish an idea to do a research institute in the U.S. And one of the fortunate things that happened in my family was in the post-Civil War period, I think, I'm not quite positive, but I think an ancestor by the name of Henry Stewart that I have, I think he's a great-great-grandfather, born in 1840. And he acquired land after the Civil War, about 160 acres in rural Williamsburg County in South Carolina. And so one of the things that happened when I was in dental school at University of Pennsylvania, I joined a group in the community in Philadelphia called the Black History Museum Committee. And these were some really sharp brothers that were really digging into all the research about black history. We were looking at books by George Washington Williams. Have you ever heard of him?
Yeah.
You ever heard of books by William J. Simmons? That's a book that really inspired me called Men of Mark, and the subtitle was Eminent, Progressive, and Rising. And it was a book about Civil War, post-Civil War African Americans and all the things that they accomplished, you know, between 1865 and in the 1900s. The book was written in 1887, and he's a brother out of Charleston, South Carolina, William J. Simmons, Men of Mark. I recommend it highly. It's got all these biographies in it, and if you read them, you'll be totally inspired by what these folks were able to accomplish, you know, just after the Civil War. And you know, they had very little education. They had to educate themselves, basically, and so that was an inspiration for me.
Men of what?
Men of Mark. You know, on that flash drive I gave you, the whole book is on there. If you look at it, you look at the title, Men of Mark. The whole book is on there. It has all these biographies. That flash drive has a huge amount of information. I actually spent some time going over what's on there, and I've actually I have some things that I've added to that. But clearly, so that's really the whole inspiration, you know, of looking at how we can build. So here's the point. So as a result of that, I used to have, when I went back to Carolina from school, I would always go see my grandfather, and we'd have these long conversations. And he had a mystical belief about stuff, and you know, obviously he had all this land in this rural area, and clearly he had obviously had a lot of offers for people to buy it, but he never bought it. So he had 6 kids, including my mom. And the logical thing for him was to leave the land to the children. Usually in most families, once they do that, they divide it up and, you know, the land gets sold and so on. But he, for whatever reason, and I was shocked, I was in South America working for the Ministry of Health in Suriname, and he passed in 77, in December 77. And then I get this phone call from my mother saying that he left everything to me. And I said, what is that all about? So I just went back to all these conversations that we had, and he probably saw some promise in his grandson and said, well, the boy is doing pretty well. Maybe I'll skip a generation. And I think that upset, you know, in fact, I was just talking about my sister about that the other day, and I was saying, boy, I wish I could tell his children, my aunts and uncles, that I want to do something for the family that's beneficial with this land. It's not, I always thought when I first heard this that it's not my personal. He just gave me the responsibility.
You're
right?
the custodian.
There you go.
Yeah.
I'm the custodian. A similar story with Matthew with his land in Texas. So what happened was all these years I kept thinking I didn't do anything with it, and it just sat there. And I kept thinking, well, I just pass it on to the next generation, or, you know, come up with an idea. And because my grandfather was always telling me that he wanted to plant mahogany trees. And he said in 80 years you can make a fortune when the mahogany trees grow. That was one of his ideas for the land. So anyway, after working on this project to set up a new university on the Red Sea in Saudi Arabia, I said, why can't we do this in the U.S.? So back in I think 3 years ago, I had this epiphany while doing a run in the park near my house that, hey, try to get a research institute established. And then as a result, I started working on a proposal, and I used a lot of the things that I learned because I was involved in a whole bunch of different aspects of this university. I joined the project when there were 10 people, when I was working for the National Oil Company, and it grew into a major university with students from all over the world, and it's ranked 121st in the world right now in terms of research impact on issues that are critical for human society, like, for example, plant genomics, where you could have plants growing in the desert or plants growing in brackish water, also clean combustion, also artificial intelligence, also carbon sequestration, and so on and so forth. All these fields that were beneficial. So I said, well, let's do this in the US. And I'm thinking the billionaire class in the US, if you think about their fortunes from the time the pandemic started until, well, the beginning of 2022, their fortunes pretty much doubled. Now, there have been some erosion over because the tech sector dropped a lot in 2022, but they still are really well placed, and also they want a world where their grandchildren will be surviving without living in a twilight struggle for existence. So I'm banking on the idea that if a strong enough proposal reaches them, they will finance setting up a research institute. And this research institute I have in mind is based on 4 areas of research. One is food security and food production research using vertical farming and aquaponics, where if we look at legacy farming using large amounts of land, large amounts of water, that's not sustainable for a human civilization that's growing. Now we have a civilization where we reach peak population by 10 billion, 11 billion, and then it's going to be a predicted decline. However, the carrying capacity of the earth for farming and the legacy, we've got to definitely develop new technologies. Like Berkeley developed, new rice species that solve hunger in Asia, and then we had huge advances in food production. But we need to have even more exponentially. So that's the first area. And right now, at this moment, we have, with the local administration in Lane, South Carolina, we have a grant with the USDA to do a feasibility study to establish the first research component, which is food production research, which would be a research hub that would then spread out the ideas to the county and to the rest of the state to shift to vertical agriculture. Now, why vertical agriculture? You use 95% less water. You don't use pesticides or fertilizer. You harvest 365 days a year because it's indoor controlled conditions. And the key point is artificial intelligence running it end to end. And that is where the future is heading right now. And this is a technology that can be exported as the research improves the technology all over the world. The second area of research that we want to focus on is climate change. And that is an area where we see the existential threat of climate change happening. So my goal and idea is to have about 200 climatologists all working together and to talk about what they can do, not only 2 things, to adapt to the changes that are inevitable, and also to mitigate the use of carbon as a technology, fossil fuels technology, which is an obsolete technology for the world. As much as we are dependent on it, we've got to shift. We have no choice, but we've got to shift to alternatives: wind, solar, geothermal, and other forms of energy, that ocean waves that we can generate that will replace our fossil fuels. All right, so why get 200 climatologists together? Okay, there's 2 projects that I use as analogs. One is the Manhattan Project, where we took the top astrophysicists and brought them into Los Alamos, and within a relatively short time, those guys with that mental, intellectual power, they came up with something that shortened World War II by a couple of years, maybe, and saved a bunch of lives, even though people died when they used it in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, the other one is the NASA project that sent men to the moon. Now, in 10 years, we had all these engineers together in Florida and Huntsville, Alabama, and Houston, Texas, and they got us on the moon, and they got these folks back safely. And by the way, it was not just one trip. It's like, I saw the last launch. I went down to Orlando, and then went over to Cape Canaveral, and I saw the Apollo 17 launch. It was a night. It was the first time the Saturn V went up at night, and it lit up the sky like day. And I was blown away when I saw these guys heading to the moon on Apollo 17. So that's the idea, that if you get smart people together, and that's what's happening at all the top universities, Cambridge, Berkeley, Stanford, Harvard, universities in France, in Germany, in Japan, China. When you get these intellects together, you come up with stuff. And all the major companies, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, all these guys have a lot of folks together who talk over lunch about what they're going to do and how they're going to invent new stuff. And so if I can get all these people together in South Carolina in Williamsburg County, I think something can come out of that.
What you gonna
Okay,
call your
the
play?
huh?
What you gonna call your play?
It's called the Mays Bennett Science Institute for an Enduring Future. And so we want to honor Benjamin Elijah Mays, and we want to honor my grandfather, Norvell Bennett. And so clearly the third area of research is health innovation, focusing on slowing down the aging process. So why do that?
No, hurry up.
The idea, yeah, we want to benefit. We don't want to be the last generation to die off, right, without reaching longevity. So there's a key point. I've done a lot of research for like 20-some years about aging and looking at the peer-reviewed literature in medicine. And one of the points that I've learned is that not only is the information increasing and the papers coming out almost daily, but there's a huge potential for, number one, slowing down the aging process, and the second point is reversing the aging process. And that technology is really moving double exponential. Question?
Ernest,
Yes.
Go ahead.
first of all, I have a question about why you want to slow down the aging process when we got a world, a population overgrowth in the world. And second of all, the result of slowing down the aging process, that means the older foods that we got today are going to be older next week.
They're gonna hang around.
They're going to hang around.
Okay, so yeah, that's good question. Good question. So here's the I would say here's a response to that idea, that point about we need to open up room for the new generation and all that, and give them jobs and so on. Just think about when a person passes. Think about the legacy knowledge that we lose in the process. And that's happened, you know.
We saw that problem with this AI shit, but
Well, okay, we're going to get to AI in a minute, but here's the point. If things go without any changes at the moment, as our population ages, it's going to be a huge burden on the healthcare system that's really unsustainable. And the reason for that is because after someone reaches 65, there's going to be a sort of a slow decline in their functionality. And that becomes a huge burden on the health system. It is estimated that a huge proportion of healthcare costs are in the last decade of life for an individual. So what we want to have is a concept that I want you to all be familiar with. It's called extend our health span. And that means that we are healthy and robust, we can travel, we can enjoy our grand and great grands, and then at some point we have a compression, if you will, of morbidity, so that you don't have a lot of age-related diseases occurring. We solve all of those. In fact, aging has to be looked at as a disease that can be solved. And that means that we'll reach a point where then we'll have a sudden drop in a couple of months and maybe pass. But then some of the researchers are saying that we'll reach something called longevity takeoff velocity. And what that means is that for every month you live, the research will add 2 months to your life. So what does that mean? That means that we have something called a bridge to a bridge to a bridge, meaning that you bridge yourself health-wise to a technology which can rejuvenate you. Okay, when you get that first rejuvenation, you are healthy enough to go to the next breakthrough in technology where you get rejuvenated further, and it can keep going. And then the only thing that might happen is an accidental, hit by a bus syndrome that can take your life. So clearly, so you say, well, what's the human carrying capacity on Earth? Well, we got to think of beyond Earth. The whole universe is out there. Humans have to have a civilization off the planet Earth because there's so much existential risk with asteroids, with super volcanoes, the Yellowstone could blow and it could be an extinction event. We could have a virus that wipes out humanity. That's possible. Right. Say if you had an Ebola or Marburg virus that was similar to the contagious potential of measles. Measles has an R naught of 14 or 15, which is the R naught meaning the rate of spread. How many people, if a person gets a measles, how many people will they infect on average? It's like 14 other people. Yes. Now the COVID virus, it had an R naught of like only about less than 2. So that means that the average person who got COVID in the original strain, if the mother strain would infect 2 other people. So that's much less than the contagious potential of measles. Now, suppose Ebola, which has a 50% mortality rate or above in West Africa, suppose that had an R naught of 15. The world's population is at risk if we don't come up with some kind of vaccine to mitigate it. So that's the risk that is inherent in a lot of things. So what do we need? We need a civilization not only on a planet somewhere. There's several potentials. One is Mars. The other one we would terraform Mars. The other one would be some of the moons of Jupiter or Saturn, which have a potential because although they are far away from the sun, they have geothermal that can create energy on those moons. The other one is to build a space station that houses thousands of people that is floating around at what we call the L5 zones. The James Webb Telescope was sent out to an L5 zone. What is an L5 zone? That's an area where there's a balance between the gravity of the moon and the Earth, where it doesn't move and it stays in a fixed position that you can then have something, so we can put a space station there that houses people, right? And
Ernie, you got about 10 minutes.
Okay.
This is fascinating, but you still
You still
got
so
10 minutes.
One point.
So let me just finish one point.
How do we modify the human
No, let me finish this last.
the human mind and not have a war between Jupiter, Earth, and the Moon?
Okay, so that's another good question, but I want to focus on the last area of research is artificial intelligence. Okay, so I think that it's super important that we have artificial intelligence research similar to a group called DeepMind out of UK that's owned by Google and also OpenAI, which developed ChatGPT, so that we can make sure that it is aligned with human values and that it will benefit humanity. And so that would be another area of research. But the most important thing this AI would do at this research institute is to support climate change research, support food production research, and to support health innovation research. And so that would be the focus of the 4th area of research of the Institute. And with that, I will conclude my presentation, and thank you for listening.
Okay, all right.
I just just want to say between Charlie gig economy and featuring your AI to make me live forever, y'all have blown my mind.
Yeah. You know what? Giles puts the E in eclectic, puts the A in adventure, and the I in intellect. We really appreciate you both. And the books, are they available on Amazon? Because
Yeah,
Gave us some last year.
they're all available on Amazon, and then I have a few copies of one of these books to pass out.
You get it with an autograph?
With an autograph. A free autograph.
Oh, Charlie.
So I'm prepared for any questions, but perhaps because I took a bit of time here, we might not.
That's okay.
Yeah.
We'll catch
Just
you
a
in the
comment.
audience.
Yes.
My question about lecturing and so forth. TED is wonderful, it's great. But there's a need to develop a segment, a wide segment of the population that can counter the corporate drive for domination. The corporate interests cannot control itself, lacks the discipline to make decisions on behalf of humanity. And without the pressure from regular folk, you know, to change, I'm afraid that we're not sustaining.
Yeah, I think keying into that point, I think that what's happening now in climate change, without the world's 190 some governments cooperating in a very efficient way to mitigate the fossil fuel emission of carbon into the atmosphere, I think that's going to be a human tragedy if it does not occur. And the IPCC has come out with reports almost every year. They just came out with a report a couple months ago, which gives a lot of dire warnings about what's going to happen. And seems as if nobody's listening. We're talking about stuff on TV that's irrelevant.
It's all about money, guys. They don't want to listen. They try to make this quick money.
Yeah.
Going back to your longevity issue about, listen, guys. I can't fight, fuck, or fart right now. So, and if you make me live 30 years, what else you gonna take from me?
Hey, but just imagine our grandchildren right now blow us away in terms of what they're doing. Just imagine interacting with your great grandchildren. Wouldn't that be a treat?
Mom,
That alone.
I can do that already.
They cannot curse it right.
Right, no cursive writing.
Let's give Ernie another round.
right now.
That's my roommate.